What if the life you saved was the one you were taught to fear most? For a lone woman on the desolate frontier, a single act of compassion spirals into a life-or-death drama. She pulls a man riddled with arrows from the jaws of a dust storm, his identity a mystery. As she secretly nurses him back to health, she's forced to lie to suspicious neighbors and a determined sheriff. But the man she's protecting is no ordinary stranger. He holds a secret that could either be her salvation or bring the wrath of an entire nation down upon her solitary cabin. This is the story of a debt a discovery, and the woman who helped a stranger only to learn she had saved the most powerful chief of the Apache people. The wind was a liar in the New Mexico territory. It could whisper through the piñón pines like a lover one moment, and scream like a banshee the next, scouring the land with sand and fury. Elara Collins knew its deceptive nature well. She had learned it in the 5 years since her husband, a man full of gold-fevered dreams, had walked into the Dragoon Mountains and never walked out. Now the silence he left behind was her constant companion, and the wind was the only voice that answered her own. Her homestead was a testament to stubbornness, a small solid cabin built of sweat and sawn timber, and a corral fashioned from weathered grey posts nestled in a shallow basin that offered the slightest protection from the elements. It was a lonely bastion against an unforgiving world miles from the nearest dusty settlement of Silver Creek. Here, the vast raw beauty of the land was a double-edged sword. The mesas that burned crimson and gold at sunset could in the blink of an eye become monstrous shadows, hiding dangers both animal and human. On this particular afternoon, the sky was the color of a day-old bruise. A coppery haze had swallowed the distant mountains, and the air had grown heavy and still, a held breath before a scream. A dust storm was coming. Not the playful dust devils that danced across the plains, but a true duster, a rolling wall of earth and grit that could strip paint from a wagon and a man of his senses. Elara moved with an economy of motion, born of habit. She secured that the leather latch on the chicken coop, the frightened clucking of her hens, a frantic counterpoint to the eerie silence. She checked the cover on her well and hauled an extra bucket of water its surface already dimpled by advance grains of sand. Her gaze, the color of faded denim, constantly swept the horizon. It was a rancher's gaze, a survivor's gaze, searching for stray cattle, for the telltale signs of a coyote, for anything that was out of place. And then she saw it. At first it was just a dark shape against the dun-colored earth, a smudge near the jagged cluster of rocks that marked the western edge of her property. It was too low for a calf, too still for a predator. A dead longhorn, perhaps, caught out in the open. But something a flicker of instinct, honed by years of solitude, prickled the back of her neck. With the wind beginning to keen and whip strands of her chestnut hair across her face, Elara grabbed the old Winchester rifle that leaned always by the door. It was heavy and familiar in her hands, a cold comfort. She didn't move toward the shape directly, but in a wide, cautious arc, her worn leather boots making little sound on the thirsty ground. As she drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was not an animal. It was a man lying face down in the dirt. An Indian. His bare back was a canvas of raw, sun-baked muscle, marred by the grotesque fletching of 3 arrows. They were not the simple hunting arrows of a lone brave. Their design was intricate. Their feathers dyed a stark, menacing black. Another arrow shaft was snapped off in his thigh. A dark, viscous stain was spreading slowly into the sand beneath him, a grim testament to his lifeblood draining away. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the rising symphony of the wind. Everything in her every lesson taught in Silver Creek, every whispered tale of raids and scalps screamed at her to turn back, to run, lock her door, and pretend she had seen nothing. He was Apache, most likely, the sworn enemy, the boogeyman of the territory, blamed for every missing cow, every spooked horse, every shadow that moved too fast at twilight. Helping him was not just foolish, it was treason in the court of public opinion. They would call her an accomplice, a sympathizer. Sheriff Thorne, a man whose piety was matched only by his suspicion, would have her run out of the territory, or worse. She took a half step back, the Winchester feeling heavier now, a burden. The wind tore at her skirt, pushing her toward the safety of her cabin. He was as good as dead anyway. No man could survive those wounds, left to the mercy of the storm and the coyotes. But then a low groan ripped from the man's throat by a gust of wind reached her ears. It was not a cry of pain, but a sound of pure, stubborn life refusing to be extinguished. His hand, curled in the dirt, twitched. Ilara stopped. Her gaze fell from the terrifying arrows to the hand. It was a strong hand, calloused and capable. A human hand. She looked at his hair, long and black as a raven's wing, matted with dust and blood. She saw the powerful line of his shoulder, the vulnerable curve of his neck. In that moment, he was not the spectre of her fears. He was not Apache. He was a man dying in the dirt at her feet. Her mother's voice, a memory as soft as worn calico, echoed in her mind. There's no good or bad when it comes to healing Ilara. Only hurtin', and not hurtin'. Her mother had been the closest thing to a doctor in their small Ohio town, a woman who knew her herbs and her stitches, who believed compassion was not a choice, but a duty. "Damn you, Ilara," whispered, though it wasn't clear if she was speaking to the man to her mother's ghost, or to God himself. The first stinging grains of the duster bit at her cheeks. The world was dissolving into a brown-red chaos. It was now or never. She leaned the Winchester against a rock, the decision made in a heartbeat that would alter the course of her life. The man was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She hooked her hands under his armpits, her own frame wiry but strong from years of hard labor. She grunted with the effort, her boots slipping in the loose soil. He was barely conscious, his head lolling back. But another groan escaped his lips as she moved him a sound that spurred her on. She dragged him inch by painful inch across the open ground. The wind howled a physical force that threatened to tear him from her grasp. Dust filled her nose and mouth, gritting between her teeth. By the time she reached the cabin door, she was gasping for breath, her muscles screaming in protest. With a final desperate heave, she pulled him over the threshold and onto the rough-hewn wooden floor. She slammed the door shut, the roar of the storm instantly muffled to a low, menacing rumble. She dropped the heavy bar into place, a definitive clang of metal that sealed them in and the rest of the world out. For a long moment, Ilara stood there, her chest heaving, leaning against the solid wood of the door. Her home, her sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage. On her floor lay the greatest secret and the greatest danger she had ever known. The storm raged outside, but within the fire-lit silence of the small cabin, a far more perilous storm was just beginning to gather. The world outside the cabin ceased to exist, swallowed by the howling, sandy abyss of the duster. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire in the hearth and the ragged, shallow breathing of the man on her floor. The flickering lamplight cast long, dancing shadows, making the small space feel both intimate and menacing. Ilara's initial surge of adrenaline gave way to a cold, creeping dread. The sheer reality of what she had done settled upon her like a shroud. She knelt beside him, her healer's instincts overriding her fear. With trembling hands, she took a knife and carefully cut away the blood-caked remnants of his buckskin leggings and breechcloth. The wound in his thigh was deep, the wood of the arrow shaft splintered within the muscle. The arrows in his back were a far greater challenge. They had been driven in with terrible force, the barbed heads lodged firmly beneath the skin. Pulling them out carelessly would tear the flesh and cause catastrophic bleeding. "All right now," she murmured, her voice soft and shaky, more for her own benefit than for the unconscious man. "Let's see to this." She moved to the large wooden chest where she kept her mother's legacy bundles of dried herbs, jars of salves, clean linen bandages, and a small leather-wrapped case containing surgical needles and gut thread. She stoked the fire, placing a pot of water on to boil. The familiar rituals calmed her nerves, creating a small island of purpose in a sea of uncertainty. First, the thigh. She washed the area as best she could with carbolic soap and whiskey, the raw sting of the alcohol making the man's body arch in a silent scream of agony. His fists clenched the knuckles white, but no sound passed his lips. His stoicism was unnerving, almost inhuman. Using a pair of pliers, she normally reserved for mending harnesses, she gripped the broken shaft. Praying for a steady hand, she pulled. The wood resisted, then came free with a sickening squelch of blood and tissue. The man's breath hitched a sharp, guttural sound, but still he did not cry out. The arrows in his back were the true test of her nerve. She knew from her mother's teachings that arrowheads like those designed for war had to be pushed through, not pulled back. It was a brutal, bloody procedure. She would have to cut into him, find the point of the arrowhead under the skin on his chest, and force it through an entirely new wound. She took a long, steadying breath, the scent of boiling yarrow and comfrey filling the air. She sharpened her smallest, sharpest knife on a whetstone. The rasp of steel on stone was a grating sound in the tense silence. Forcing him onto his side, she began her work. The man was delirious now, his body burning with fever. He began to mutter low, guttural words in a language she did not recognize. The words were not pleas or curses, but seemed to be commands spoken with a strange, fever-fueled authority that sent a chill down her spine. His eyes, when they briefly fluttered open, were dark and unfocused, but they held a glint of something fierce and untamed. She worked for hours, sweat beading on her brow and trickling down her temples. She pushed the first arrowhead through the man's body, convulsing violently. She packed the wounds with a poultice of crushed yarrow to staunch the bleeding and stitched them closed with neat, practiced motions. One by one, the arrows were removed, each one a small, vicious battle. By the time she was done, the floorboards around him were dark with blood, and her own arms were streaked with it. She was exhausted emotionally and physically drained, but he was alive. The ragged breathing had evened out slightly, settling into the deep, albeit troubled sleep of a man hovering between worlds. She cleaned him as gently as she could and covered him with a heavy wool blanket. She sat in her rocking chair by the fire, the Winchester now back in its place by the door, and watched him. In the flickering light, his face was all harsh angles and uncompromising strength. A high-bridged nose, a wide, firm mouth, and a jaw that looked as though it were carved from the surrounding mesas. Even in his weakened state, he possessed a presence and aura of command that filled the small cabin. Who was this man who could endure such agony in silence? The storm raged for 2 days. Elara was a prisoner in her own home. The silence inside, punctuated only by the man's feverish muttering and the constant howl of the wind. She forced broth between his lips, changed his bandages, and kept the fire going. In those long, isolated hours, a strange intimacy grew. She learned the landscape of his body, the old silvery scars that crisscrossed his chest and arms, the powerful musculature, the surprising softness of his hair. She was bound to him by the secret of his survival. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind died. A pale, watery sunlight filtered through the grime-caked window pane. The world was remade, coated in a fine layer of reddish-brown dust. The silence that followed the storm was profound, almost unnerving. It was in this silence that a new sound intruded, a sharp, insistent rapping on her door. Elara's blood ran cold. No one ever came to her door unannounced. She froze her eyes, darting from the door to the sleeping figure on the floor. He was still unconscious, but his presence felt as loud as a shout. "Elara Collins. You in there?" The voice was thin and reedy, with a nasal quality that grated on the nerves. Prudence Hatcher, a widow from Silver Creek, who owned the small mercantile and whose chief export was gossip. Prudence sometimes made the trip out to the surrounding homesteads to deliver goods and collect news like a bee collecting pollen. "Just a moment," Elara called out, her voice higher than usual. She scrambled, her mind racing. She threw another blanket over the man, hoping it might look like a simple bundle of laundry in the dim light. She kicked a blood-soaked rag under her cot and wiped her hands on her apron. She took a deep breath and lifted the bar, opening the door just a crack. Prudence. What a surprise. Prudence Hatcher stood there, a bonnet tied tightly under her chin, her bird-like eyes already trying to peer past Elara into the cabin's interior. "A surprise is right. Thought this duster might have carried you off to Kansas. Just checking on my customers." Her gaze was sharp, missing nothing. "Smells medicinal in here." "You ailin' Elara? Just a head cold coming on." Elara lied, trying to keep her body positioned to block the view. "The dust always gets to my chest." "Humph." Prudence's eyes narrowed. "Well, you should know the whole town's in an uproar. A patrol from Fort Bowie found poor old Elias Thorne's horse wandering near the pass with 2 Apache arrows in its flank. The man himself is missing, presumed dead." She paused for dramatic effect. "Sheriff Thorne is gathering a posse. He says the Chiricahua are on the move. Says he'll string up any man or woman found giving them aid." The words hung in the air like smoke. Elara felt a wave of dizziness. Elias was the sheriff's brother, a prospector known for his belligerence and his hatred of the local tribes. So that was it. The arrows in her patient weren't from some tribal skirmish. They were from a fight with a white man. A fight that had left the sheriff's brother dead. "That's terrible news." Elara managed her throat dry. Prudence leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Some say they saw tracks. A half-dozen braves, and one of them was wounded, leaving a blood trail. The trail headed this way, before the storm wiped it clean." Her sharp little eyes flicked past Elara one more time, trying to penetrate the shadows of the cabin. For a heart-stopping second, her gaze seemed to linger on the lump of blankets on the floor. A low moan came from the lump. Elara's heart leapt into her throat. "Must be the wind in the chimney," Elara said quickly, a little too loudly. It's been making awful noises since the storm. Prudence straightened up, a strange, knowing smirk on her thin lips. Is that so? Well, you take care of that cold, dear. Sheriff Thorne is a man who notices things. He'll be coming around asking questions. Best to have your story straight. With a final penetrating look, she turned and walked back to her buggy. Elara watched her go, her hand gripping the doorframe so tightly her knuckles were white. She closed the door and barred it, her back sliding down the rough wood until she was sitting on the floor. She was no longer just a healer. She was a liar, an accomplice to a man who had likely killed the sheriff's brother. And the most dangerous woman in Silver Creek knew something was wrong. The secret in the silence of her cabin had just grown teeth. The wake of Prudence Hatcher's visit left a toxic residue in the air, a poison of fear that was more potent than any fever. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind whistling through the eaves, sounded like the approach of Sheriff Thorne and his posse. Elara felt as though she were living on a crumbling cliff edge. The secret she harbored was no longer a simple matter of compassion. It had become a matter of her own survival. Her patient remained lost in the grey twilight of delirium for another day. He tossed and turned, his muttered words occasionally rising in volume, sharp and guttural. He spoke of mountains and eagles, of raids and honor. Elara, listening while she stirred her stew or mended a tear in her dress, began to piece together a fragmented portrait of his life, a life of immense responsibility and constant conflict. On the 5th day since she'd dragged him from the storm, the fever broke. Elara was dozing fitfully in her rocking chair when a profound stillness in the cabin woke her. The man's ragged, feverish breathing had smoothed into a slow, deep rhythm. She went to his side and placed a hand on his forehead. The fire was gone. His skin was cool and damp. She was changing the bandage on his thigh when his eyes opened. They were not the wild, unfocused eyes of his delirium. They were dark, lucid, and profoundly intelligent. They held the ancient stillness of deep water, and in their depths she saw caution assessment and a flicker of gratitude. He did not speak. He simply watched her, his gaze following her every movement as she finished her work. His silence more potent than any question. The dynamic in the cabin shifted instantly. He was no longer a passive body to be tended, but a conscious presence. An unnerving awareness grew between them. A silent conversation played out in glances and gestures. When she brought him a bowl of thin broth, he pushed himself up into a sitting position, his back against the wall. The effort cost him a fine sheen of sweat breaking out on his brow. But he refused her help. His pride was a tangible force in the room. He took the bowl, his large hands surprisingly steady, and nodded his head once, a small formal gesture of thanks. As he drank, his eyes never left hers. It was an unnerving, penetrating gaze, as if he were looking past her skin and bone and into the very heart of her resolve. Elara found herself looking away, feeling strangely vulnerable. For 3 days this was their language, silence, gestures, and shared space. She learned that he preferred the broth with wild onions, that he slept without moving like a stone, and that his eyes, when he thought she wasn't looking, would trace the lines of her cabin, the rifle by the door, the well-worn book of poetry on her small shelf. He was studying her, just as she was studying him. A fragile, unspoken trust began to form a bridge built across a chasm of culture and conflict. It was a trust born of shared vulnerability. He was dependent on her for his life, and she was dependent on his silence for hers. One afternoon, while she was cleaning and oiling her Winchester, a task she now performed with a heightened sense of urgency, he spoke. "The wound. It is clean." His voice startled her. It was deeper than she had imagined, a low rumble like distant thunder. His English was heavily accented, the words deliberate and carefully chosen, but clear. Elara's hands stilled on the rifle. She looked at him surprised. "I did my best." "You have a healer's hands," he said. It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact. He looked at the arrowheads she had placed on the mantelpiece, grim metal trophies of her ordeal. "And a warrior's nerve. It was either that or watch you die," she replied, her tone more brusque than she intended. He considered this for a moment. Many in your world would have chosen the second. The truth of his words hung between them undeniable. "My world isn't always right," she said quietly, turning her attention back to the rifle. "My name is Mangus," he said, breaking the ensuing silence. Elara paused. "I'm Elara," he nodded slowly. Mangus. The name meant nothing to her, just a name. It was a relief in a way. It kept him anonymous, a man without a tribe, without a past that could get her hanged. As his strength returned, he began to move around the small cabin, testing his legs. He was taller than she had realized, his frame lean but powerful. He moved with a startling grace, a fluid economy of motion that spoke of a life lived in tune with the natural world. He would stand for long periods by the window, looking out at the landscape, his expression unreadable. Elara wondered what he was thinking, what he saw out there. Was he looking for his people or for his enemies? One evening, as she was preparing his nightly poultice, she noticed the small leather bag that she'd taken from his waist when she first tended to him. She had placed it on her shelf and forgotten about it. Now her curiosity piqued. She picked it up. It was made of soft, supple deer hide and adorned with intricate beadwork, tiny blue and white beads forming a pattern like a sky full of stars. The craftsmanship was exquisite, far beyond that of a common warrior. Hesitantly, she loosened the drawstring. Inside, nestled in soft rabbit fur, were 3 items: a polished, egg-shaped stone of pure white quartz, a single, perfect eagle feather, its tip dyed red, and a small carved wooden figure of a mountain lion, its tiny eyes inlaid with chips of turquoise. These were not random trinkets. They felt significant, sacred. The eagle feather, she knew, was a symbol of great honor among many tribes. The sheer quality of the items spoke of status, of importance. A cold knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. The anonymity she had clung to was beginning to unravel. This was not just a man named Mangus. This was someone of consequence. She was still holding the bag when he turned from the window. His eyes immediately fell to the object in her hands. He didn't look angry, but a sudden shuttered stillness came over his features. He walked toward her and held out his hand. Elara placed the medicine bag in his palm. His fingers closed around it, his expression softening as he looked at the familiar object. "This was my father's," he said, his voice low, "and his father's before him." He looked up from the bag, his dark eyes meeting hers. In them, she saw a flicker of conflict, a debate on how much to reveal. He seemed to come to a decision. "The man," he said, his voice hard. "The one with the horse." "Thorn." Elara's breath caught. "What about him?" "He found our camp. He was drunk. He dishonored a sacred place." Mangus's jaw tightened, the muscle flexing. He shot first. "My young cousin fell." We returned fire. It was not a battle we sought. Elara sank onto the edge of her cot, the weight of his words pressing down on her. So Prudence had been wrong. It wasn't an ambush. It was a fight. A fight started by the sheriff's brother. It didn't change the fact that a white man was dead, but it changed the color of the truth muddying the clear waters of right and wrong. My people scattered. Mangas continued his gaze, distant, lost in the memory. The others drew away the posse. I was leading them west toward the stronghold when the others found us. Others, Elara asked. Not your people, he said, a hint of an old, deep bitterness in his tone. Jicarilla scouts. They hunt for the soldiers, for the bounty. They are our blood, but they spill it for blue coats and silver. A rival tribe. Betrayal. It was a twist she had not anticipated, a layer of complexity that made the situation even more precarious. He was being hunted not only by the posse, but by his own kind. He looked at her then, a long, appraising look that made her feel as if he were weighing her soul. You have saved a life, Elara. Such a debt is not easily paid. You should know the weight of the life you hold in your hands. He paused, and for a moment she thought he would tell her everything. But he only shook his head slightly as if deciding against it. Rest. Your sheriff will come soon, and you will need your strength. He turned away, leaving her with a handful of truths that only deepened the mystery and a growing certainty that the man named Mangas was far more than he appeared. The weight of his life was growing heavier by the hour, and she feared it would soon be too heavy for her small cabin to bear. The fragile peace of the cabin, a sanctuary born of secrecy and shared survival, was shattered by the baying of a hound. It was a deep, mournful sound that echoed across the basin, a harbinger of the world Elara had tried so desperately to keep at bay. Mangas, who had been sitting by the fire, carving a piece of scrap wood with a small knife, went utterly still. The knife stopped moving, his head lifted, and his body became a study in tense readiness. He rose in a single fluid motion and moved to the window, peering out through a small crack in the shutter. One man, he said, his voice a low whisper, and a dog. Elara's heart began to pound, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She knew that dog. It was an old bloodhound named Judge, and he belonged to one man, Sheriff Bartholomew Thorne. "It's the sheriff," she said, her voice tight with panic. "He's here." She looked around the cabin in a frenzy. Mangas was still weak, but he was on his feet. There was nowhere for him to hide. The cabin was a single room, a cot, a table, a hearth. The cellar, she hissed, pointing to a trapdoor hidden beneath a bearskin rug. It was a small, musty space where she kept her preserves and potatoes, barely large enough for a man to crouch in. Mangas looked from the door to her face, his expression grim. He gave a sharp, reluctant nod. He understood. Without a word, he crossed the room, lifted the heavy rug, and raised the trap door. Just before he descended into the darkness, he paused and looked at her. His eyes held a warning. "Be careful." Then he was gone, pulling the door down behind him. Elara quickly threw the rug back over it, smoothing the fur to hide the seams. She took a deep, shaky breath, wiped her suddenly damp palms on her apron, and went to the door. Sheriff Thorne was a tall, gaunt man, whose face seemed permanently fixed in an expression of grim disapproval. He wore his piety like a shield and his badge like a weapon. He stood on her porch, holding the reins of his horse, the old hound, sitting faithfully at his feet, its tail giving a lazy thump, thump, thump against the wood. "Afternoon. Mrs. Collins," he said, his voice as dry as the dust on his boots. He removed his hat, revealing a pate of thinning grey hair. Sheriff Ilara replied, forcing a calmness she did not feel. She leaned against the door jamb, trying to appear casual. "What brings you all the way out here, official business?" His eyes, the color of dishwater, roamed over her, then past her into the cabin. "Following up on the matter of my brother's death, I heard the news from Prudence Hatcher," Ilara said. "It's a terrible thing." "Indeed." The sheriff's gaze was sharp, probing. "Mrs. Hatcher also mentioned you seemed unwell, and that she smelled something medicinal about the place." "A chest cold." Ilara repeated her lie, forcing a small cough. "It's passing now." The hound at Thorn's feet suddenly lifted its head, its nose twitching. It let out a low whine and took a step toward the cabin door, its nostrils flaring. "Easy, Judge Thorn," said, tugging on the leash. But the dog was fixated, its attention drawn to the floor near the hearth. Right where the trap door was. Ilara's blood turned to ice. A bloodhound. Of all the things he could have brought, he brought a dog with a nose that could follow a ghost's trail. "Seems Judge smells something more interesting than a chest cold," Thorn said, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "You had any visitors lately, Mrs. Collins? Any strangers passing through?" "No one," she said, her voice unwavering, despite the tremor in her soul. "You're the first person I've seen since before the storm, besides Prudence." The lie felt slick and unnatural in her mouth. She was a woman who valued honesty, who lived a simple, straightforward life. This deception was a heavy cloak suffocating her. "Is that so?" Thorn took a step closer. "Because the tracks we lost in the storm, the ones left by the Apache who killed my brother, they led in this direction, a half-dozen of them, and one was bleeding badly." He was staring directly at her now, his gaze intense, accusatory. He was not asking questions. He was making statements, trying to catch her in a trap. Below her feet from the cellar came a faint scraping sound. Mangus was shifting his position. The hound heard it, its ears perking up, a low growl rumbling in its chest. "That's just the rats in the cellar," Ilara said quickly, her mind racing. "They've been a nuisance all winter." Thorn did not look convinced. He took another step, placing his boot on the edge of her porch. He was going to push his way in. She could see it in his eyes. He was a man propelled by grief and a righteous fury, and he had found a target for his suspicion. "With all due respect," Sheriff Ilara said, her voice dropping, taking on a hard, steely edge she didn't know she possessed. "I am a widow alone on this property. I don't take kindly to being interrogated on my own porch. I told you I haven't seen anyone. If you have evidence to the contrary, I suggest you produce it. Otherwise, I have chores to attend to." Her sudden fortitude seemed to take him by surprise. He had expected a timid, frightened woman he could easily intimidate. He had not expected this cool defiance. He stared at her for a long, tense moment. The silence stretched taut between them. The hound whined again, pawing at the door. "You're hiding something, Mrs. Collins," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I can feel it, and I will find out what it is. Aiding an Apache is a capital offense in this territory. Remember that." He put his hat back on a gesture of finality. He pulled on the hound's leash, dragging the reluctant dog away from the cabin. "I'll be back," he said, the words a clear threat, "and next time I may not be so inclined to observe pleasantries." Ilara watched him mount his horse and ride away, the hound trotting behind until they were just a speck on the horizon. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. She stumbled back inside and collapsed into her rocking chair, her body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. She lifted the rug and opened the trapdoor. Mangas emerged from the darkness, his face a mask of grim fury. "He knows," Mangas said. It wasn't a question. He suspects Elara corrected, though she barely believed it herself. "The dog. It smelled you." Mangus's eyes were dark with a cold, dangerous light. "He will not be the only one. The Jicarilla scouts will not give up so easily. They know this land as well as I do. They will be watching." He looked at Elara, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. "You put yourself in the path of a storm for me. First the dust, now the law." "He would have died," Elara said simply, as if that explained everything. In the days that followed, a new tension settled over the homestead. They were no longer just hiding a secret. They were living under siege. Mangas, now stronger, became her partner in vigilance. He taught her things her husband never had. How to read the signs of the land. How a broken twig, an unnatural silence in the bird song, or the distant glint of the sun on a spyglass could signal an observer. He showed her how to muffle the sound of her chopping wood, how to bank her fire to produce less smoke. Their shared danger forged a bond between them that was deeper than words. In the evenings they would talk. He spoke of his people, the Chiricahua, a proud and fierce tribe, being squeezed from all sides by the encroaching world of the white man. He spoke of the sacredness of the mountains of the spirits that lived in the wind and the water. He never spoke of his own importance, but Elara could hear it in the way he talked about his duty to his people. He carried their survival on his shoulders. She in turn told him of her life in Ohio, of her bookish father and her herbalist mother. She told him about her husband, about his dreams, and how they had turned to dust in these same mountains. She found herself speaking of things she had not uttered to another soul, the loneliness and the quiet grief she had borne in silence. He listened, his dark eyes full of a surprising empathy. He saw not a foolish woman or a member of an enemy race, but another survivor, someone who had also known loss and hardship. One night, as a coyote howled from a distant mesa, he looked at her across the fire-lit cabin. "You are not like the others," he said. "Your heart is not hard." "Neither is yours," she replied quietly, "for a man who has seen so much war." He fell silent, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Sometimes," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "a man must go to war, not because he hates what is in front of him, but because he loves what is behind him." Elara understood. He was fighting for his family, his land, his way of life. In that moment, the lines of allegiance, of law and crime, of white and Apache blurred into insignificance. All she saw was a man of honor, trapped in a world that was trying to crush him. And she had thrown her lot in with his. Sheriff Thorne was coming back, she knew it. The world was encroaching, and soon the walls of her small cabin would no longer be enough to hold it back. The attack, when it came, was nothing like Elara had imagined. There was no war cry, no thunder of hooves. It began with silence, an unnatural, profound silence that fell over the land just after dawn. The morning birdsong ceased abruptly. The chirping of the crickets died away. It was as if the world was holding its breath. Mangas felt it first. He was outside, testing his strength by splitting firewood, when he suddenly froze, the axe held motionless in mid-swing. His head lifted, his nostrils flared, and his eyes scanned the rim of the basin that cradled the homestead. "They are here," he said, his voice low and calm, devoid of any panic. He walked briskly back into the cabin, his movements fluid and purposeful. Elara, who had been kneading dough on the table, felt a surge of cold fear. Thorn. No, Mangus said, his eyes meeting hers. Not Thorn. My people. Before Elara could process his words, they appeared. One moment the rocky ridge was empty, the next it was lined with them. 5 figures on horseback, sitting motionless, outlined against the pale morning sky. They were not the wild, painted demons of her imagination. They were lean, hard men, their faces impassive, their eyes missing nothing. They carried rifles across their laps, and a quiet, lethal authority that was more terrifying than any scream. Elara's breath hitched. They had found him, and they had found her. Mangus stepped out of the cabin, his hands held open at his sides in a gesture of peace. He stood in the open waiting. He did not call out. He simply made himself visible. One of the riders detached himself from the group and began to make his way down the rocky slope. He rode with a confident, easy grace, his horse picking its way carefully through the treacherous terrain. As he drew closer, Elara could see the intricate beadwork on his moccasins and the eagle feather tied in his long black hair. His face was a mask of stern concentration, his eyes fixed on Mangus, and then with a flicker of suspicion on her as she stood half hidden in the doorway of the cabin. The warrior reined in his horse a few feet from Mangus. He said nothing, his gaze sweeping over his leader, taking in the clean bandages, the healing wounds, the relative strength in his posture. His eyes then moved to the cabin, to the thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney to the neatly swept porch. His expression was a mixture of relief, confusion, and deep-seated suspicion. He finally spoke, his voice sharp and guttural in the Apache tongue. It was a question demanding and urgent. Mangus replied in the same language, his tone calm and authoritative. The exchange was brief, a volley of words Elara could not understand, but whose meaning was plain. The warrior was demanding to know what had happened, who this white woman was. Mangus was providing answers, his voice carrying the unmistakable weight of command. The warrior dismounted. He was younger than Mangus, but with the same hard, capable look about him. He approached his leader and gripped his forearm, a gesture of fierce loyalty and respect. More words were exchanged softer this time. Then the warrior turned his dark, mistrustful eyes on Elara. He took a step toward her. "You," he said, his English thick but understandable. "You did this. You healed him." Elara could only nod her throat, too tight to speak. The warrior's gaze was hard, searching for any sign of deception. He looked back at Mangus, who gave a slight affirmative nod. A look of grudging respect, warring with a lifetime of ingrained hatred for her kind, flickered across the younger man's face. It was at that precise moment, with the tension stretched as taut as a bowstring, that a new sound intruded. The familiar dreaded baying of the hound judge, followed by the sound of multiple horses approaching at a trot. Nantan Lupan the warrior spat the Apache name for the grey wolf the soldiers. In this case, the law. Mangus's head snapped up, his brief moment of reunion shattered. He looked toward the path that led to Silver Creek. Sheriff Thorne was coming, and he was not alone. The glint of sunlight on rifle barrels told Elara he had brought his posse. The 4 other Apache warriors on the ridge had seen the approaching riders as well. In an instant, they melted back from the skyline, disappearing as if they had never been there. The young warrior by the cabin instinctively drew a long knife from his belt, his eyes flashing with feral light. "No." Mangas commanded, his voice sharp as cracking stone. "Not here." He put a hand on the young warrior's shoulder, a gesture that was both calming and commanding. He then turned to Elara, his eyes locking with hers. There was no time for explanations, no time for fear. "Stay in the cabin," he said. It was then that the full, crushing weight of the truth finally descended upon Elara. The young warrior, his eyes still blazing with defiance, but his body obeying his leader, looked at Mangas and spoke a single phrase in his own language, a phrase uttered with the deepest reverence. And then he looked at Elara and translated his voice, full of a hostile awe. "He is Mangas Coloradas," the warrior said, his words striking Elara with the force of a physical blow. "Chief of the Chiricahua Apache, our leader, our heart." Elara stumbled back into the doorframe, her mind reeling. Mangas Coloradas, the red sleeves, a name whispered with fear and respect across the entire territory. A legendary leader, a brilliant strategist, a man who had united the Apache bands and held the American army at bay for decades. He was not just a chief, he was the chief, a living legend, a king, and he had been bleeding on her floor, his life held in her trembling hands. The posse rounded the last bend, kicking up a cloud of dust. Sheriff Thorne was in the lead, his face a thunderous mask of grim satisfaction. Beside him rode Prudence Hatcher, her face alight with vindictive triumph. She pointed a bony finger directly at the cabin. There were at least 10 other men, with them rough men from the town and surrounding ranches, all armed, all with the same hard, merciless look in their eyes. They reined in their horses, forming a loose, menacing semicircle in front of the small homestead, their rifles held ready. A dramatic, impossible standoff. On one side, the law of the white man, armed with guns and righteous fury. On the other, the most revered leader of the Apache nation, weakened but unbowed, standing beside the lone white woman who had saved him. Sheriff Thorne's gaze fell upon Mangas, and a look of stunned disbelief crossed his face, quickly replaced by a predatory gleam. He had not expected to find his quarry alive, let alone standing tall. "Well, well," Thorne boomed, his voice dripping with venom. "Look what the cat dragged in. It seems Mrs. Hatcher's suspicions were well-founded." He swung his gaze to Elara, his eyes full of contempt. "You'll hang for this woman, harboring a murdering savage." The young Apache warrior took a menacing step forward, his knife flashing in the morning sun. The men in the posse raised their rifles, the clicks of hammers being cocked, echoing in the sudden, deathly silence. The fragile peace of the basin was about to be shattered by a volley of lead and a river of blood. Elara looked at Mangas Coloradas, the chief she had known only as a quiet, wounded man, and saw the leader of a nation emerge. His shoulders squared, his eyes blazing with the fire of 1,000 campfires ready to meet the storm he had brought to her door. The air grew thick, charged with the metallic taste of imminent violence. Rifles from the posse were all trained on Mangas, and his warrior fingers tight on triggers. Prudence Hatcher watched from her horse, her face a mask of rapturous vindication. This was the story she would tell for the rest of her life. Sheriff Thorne raised his pistol, aiming it squarely at the chief's chest. "It's over, Red Sleeves," he snarled, using the famous name like an epithet. Your murdering days are done. Drop the knife, he barked at the younger warrior, or I'll put a hole in your chief right now. The young warrior Cochise braced himself to charge a martyr's fire in his eyes. It was then that Mangas acted. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply took one step forward, deliberately, placing his body in front of Elara's, shielding her. He raised a hand, not in surrender, but as a call for silence. And then he spoke. Your brother was a thief, Sheriff Thorne. His death was not murder. The voice that emerged was not the one Elara knew. The accent was gone. In its place was a voice of profound authority, speaking perfect, eloquent English with the cadence of a scholar and the command of a king. The stunning shock of it sent a wave of unease through the posse. Even Thorne's pistol wavered. He desecrated a burial site of my ancestors. The chief continued, his voice calm and clear. When confronted, he fired his weapon and killed my nephew. We returned fire. That is the law of the desert. It was not a raid. It was justice. Thorne sneered, recovering his composure. Justice, an Apache. Speaking of justice, you are a killer, and this woman is your accomplice. This woman, Mangas, said, his voice dropping. Taking on a dangerous edge is a healer. She found me near death, shot not by your brother, but by jicarilla trackers who hunt their own kind for your government's silver. She is guilty of nothing but a compassion that seems to be in short supply among your people. He turned his gaze back to Thorne, and it was as hard and unforgiving as flint. Let me be clear, Sheriff. My warriors are in the hills around this basin. They are silent, and they are waiting for my signal. If a single shot is fired at this woman, if a single hair on her head is harmed, I will consider it a personal attack upon myself. And I will unleash a war upon this territory that will make your ancestors weep. She is under the protection of the Chiricahua Apache. An attack on her is an attack on our nation. It was not a boast. It was a vow backed by the promise of total war. The men of the posse understood it implicitly. They were ranchers and storekeeps, not soldiers. The idea of waking a sleeping, bloody giant like Mangas Coloradus over the fate of one reclusive widow was a terrifyingly high price to pay. They began to lower their rifles, avoiding Thorne's gaze, their thirst for vengeance extinguished. Thorne stood his ground, but the folle in his eyes had been replaced by a dawning horror. He was outmaneuvered, outclassed. He had come expecting a wounded animal and found a king. This ain't over, he muttered, but the words were hollow. Leave, Mangas said. It was a dismissal. Swallowing his pride, his face mottled with rage and humiliation, Thorne turned his horse. The posse turned and rode away, not with the swagger of lawmen, but with the haste of trespassers. The clearing was quiet again. The Apache warriors emerged from the hills bringing a fresh horse for their leader. Mangas turned to Elara. The regal authority fell away, and for a moment he was again the man who had shared her fire. I have brought you great trouble, Elara, he said softly. You brought me the truth, she replied, her voice steady. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out the small carved wooden mountain lion with the turquoise eyes. He pressed it into her hand. So long as you carry this, he said, my people will know you. You are the healer of the chief, a friend to the Chiricahua. No harm will ever come to you in these lands from my people. This is my promise. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement of the canyon between their worlds and the unbreakable bridge of honor they had built across it. He mounted his horse, sitting tall in the saddle, every inch the king. With a final nod to Alara, he turned and, surrounded by his warriors, rode toward the mountains, never looking back. Alara stood in front of her cabin, the small wooden carving warm in her palm, and watched them go. She was alone again, but the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of a life saved, the echo of a chief's promise, and the power of a secret that forever marked her as a friend to the Apache nation. The frontier was a land of brutal truths, but for Alara Collins, the most powerful truth was one of compassion. Her story isn't just a tale of the Old West. It's a testament to the fact that courage isn't about the fight you pick, but the life you choose to save. She defied her world, risked everything for a stranger, and in return received the protection of a king. Her solitary life was forever changed, marked by a debt of honor that transcended boundaries of race and conflict. What do you think happened to Alara? Did the sheriff ever return? Did she ever see the chief again? We leave those questions to the whispers of the wind. If this story of courage, conflict, and unexpected connection moved you, please help our channel grow by hitting that like button, sharing it with someone who loves a powerful historical drama, and subscribing for more tales from the dusty trails of history. Thank you for listening.